Graiguenamanagh ceili band developed from another ceili band in Graiguenamanagh, County Kilkenny, which is called St. Joseph's ceili band. We changed the name in 1965. The night before, we headed to Churchtown in Dublin to make a recording for Connoisseur Records. The band started, I suppose, back in the early 60s. There were two local boatmen. Graiguenamanagh is a great place for canal boats. Up to 1960, there were up to 60 families depending on the canal boats for a living. And two of the canal boatmen, Tom Nolan and Eddie Hayden, used to travel all over the country, and they used to bring their button accordions with them to play in the evenings when they had probably nothing else to do, stuck in little harbours along the Grand Canal and down in places like Terryglass and Gary Kennedy and Killaloo. And they got to know two people down in the Clare area, Paul Brock, the accordion player, and a young Seamus Connolly, whose father was the lock keeper in the lock at the time in Killaloo. And they used to play with them and learn their tunes, and they brought them back to Graiguenamanagh.
So they're travelling to the west of Ireland, learning the tunes there. They brought them back to Graiguenamanagh. But was there a traditional scene in Graiguenamanagh there ready to receive that music?
Oh, there was indeed, yeah. Graig has always had a tradition of music. Way back to the... there was a brass band there, not traditional band, but brass band from 1760. And I suppose a lot of the young fellas got their first rudiments in musical theory with the brass band, and then went on from that. Irish was spoken in Graiguenamanagh up to the beginning of the 1900s. My grandfather, who was born in 1867, used to tell me about that, and he spoke Irish to me all the time. But his cousin, Patrick O'Leary, was a great collector of Irish music, collected 18 tunes which he gave to P.W. Joyce, and P.W. Joyce published them in his book back in 1909. And we would play those tunes which we got from my father, handed down from Patrick O'Leary. And I suppose there was also plenty of visiting, I suppose you call them travelling musicians, and Patrick O'Leary used to pick up their tunes, wouldn't let them out of the place without writing down any tunes they had. That and local tunes from local boatmen.
Now, let's pinpoint Graiguenamanagh. It's in County Kilkenny, but tell us, can you get us closer to Graiguenamanagh? How would we find it, let's say?
I can indeed. Graiguenamanagh is a very picturesque little town on the River Barrow, at the foot of Brandon Hill. Brandon Hill is called after St. Brendan of Kerry, and they say he had a church there as well. It straddles the Barrow. The other side of the river is Tinnyhinch. Graiguenamanagh is Kilkenny side, Tinnyhinch is the other side, and of course there's great rivalry between the two, especially when it comes to matches and that kind of thing. It's about 23 miles south of Carlow. We're probably more closely connected with Carlow than Kilkenny, although we're in County Kilkenny. And the River Barrow flows under a beautiful bridge built in the 1700s by George Semple, blown up by the Charles Askell, I think it was, in 1798 to prevent the rebels getting from Wexford into Kilkenny. But the river had to take a bend just below Graiguenamanagh to avoid Brandon Hill, and it's really beautiful country.
You would say that, wouldn't you? Of course, you're from there. Is your father from there?
Yes, my father was from there. My great-great-grandfather was a blow-in to Graiguenamanagh in 1819. He came from Clonegall in County Carlow on the Wexford border and set up a bakery in Graiguenamanagh. And 4 generations later, my father was still making bread up to 1968.
There are 3 O'Leary names associated with the Graiguenamanagh ceili band: Michael J. O'Leary, Peter O'Leary, that's yourself, and Michael F. O'Leary. Tell us about the connections. Are they all related?
They are. Well, my father was Michael F. for Fiacre, because St. Fiacre had a church in Ullard, 3 miles upstream, and it's a good name, popular name in Graiguenamanagh. Michael Fiacre O'Leary was my father. He died in 1993. He was a very good guitarist, and he also played fiddle and banjo. Michael John O'Leary is my brother. He's 6 years younger than me, and he now is probably one of the best guitar makers in Ireland, which is interesting.
It certainly is, and there's an interesting question there now that you mentioned your father and guitars, because there's a wonderful photograph here of the band and your father there holding the Gibson guitar there in the background. An unusual setup really. I don't see the piano, I see a guitar and a double bass and a drum with the Graiguenamanagh ceili band. Did you cause a bit of controversy with that lineup?
We certainly did. We weren't popular with Coltis at the time, because They considered it harmony. A piano was, I think, accepted, but a guitar was not.
You mentioned travelling around the country. Would people have heard of you much further afield than County Kilkenny?
Yes, we travelled, well, of course, first of all through County Kilkenny, but we went as far north, believe it or not, as Port Arlington, where we used to play with Sean Ryan and his ceili band. We were very friendly with Sean and his band, and we played with them. We used to go do a lot of work in Wexford, in Carlow, and down as far as Waterford, down as far as Dungarvan in Waterford. Mind you, it was hard work, because I used to travel from Donegal to get down for a concert or for a ceili, and work for 5 hours and then travel back afterwards, you know.
I think they call that dedication, Peter. Now, let's talk about the music, because you made an LP. I was going to say you made a CD, but you made an LP in 1965. And I think what we'll do is we'll listen to a couple of jigs from that LP, but I want to talk to you about the circumstances of that recording and how you actually got involved in making the record. But maybe you'll call a selection of jigs for us.
I will. I think a good selection from the setup was Hartigan's Fancy, Maloney's Wife, and The Bush and the Hill.
Hartigan's Fancy, Maloney's Wife, and The Bush on the Hill. They're from the Graiguenamanagh ceili band, recorded in 1965. You're listening to Ceili House, the archives here on RTE Radio 1 tonight, and I'm talking to Peter O'Leary, who was an original member of the Graiguenamanagh ceili band. Peter arrived here. I was asking him a few questions about the Graiguenamanagh, and he arrived with a file on the band. So we're going to find out a little bit more about the Graiguenamanagh ceili band from Peter. Peter, we picked those tunes. The first thing I noticed, of course, Hartigan's Fancy, some people will recognise that as the humours of Ennis Diamond with an extra bit in it.
That's right. The extra bit is the Clare bit, you see. Yeah.
You went to Dublin to make an LP. That has to have been unusual for any group of musicians.
It was very unusual, yeah. In fact, it all happened. There was the owner of a local radio and television shop in Graiguenamanagh called Micheál Reddy. And Micheál was very fond of the band. He used to record us on a reel-to-reel. And he used to do a lot of work with Connoisseur Records. They were big distributors. They were in Cope Street in Dublin. And he persuaded them that they should do an LP of the Graiguenamanagh ceili band. And we got that set up and organised. We practiced very hard. And one Sunday morning early, we headed up, it was on October the 3rd, I think, we headed up to Dublin. That was in 1965, October the 3rd, 65. We headed up to Churchtown, to the studio in Churchtown belonging to a Jerry Fitzgerald. I think he used to do some work for RTE as well. And we had the ceili band and Christy Bulger, who was our vocalist, because it was a mixture of ceili and what you could call old time that we played at the time. So we spent all day in Jerry's studio recording. On a few occasions he had to put pieces of sponge under the feet of the players to stop the foot tapping from going through. Nowadays, I suppose, with people like Labotti and Soriant, it's quite fashionable to have it, but then it wasn't. We got paid, I can't remember what we got paid, I think it was about £16 on our petrol expenses, that was about it, and we signed all the rights over to Connoisseur Records, and it was supposed to be the first stereo ceili group LP ever made, and we were very proud. We went back home happy that we hadn't played too many mistakes, or if we had, they probably weren't going to be noticed. And that was the last we heard of it for a long, long time. We used to call Connoisseur Records and ask them what's happening, and we never got a proper answer. And we gave up asking in the end. We just forgot about it. And years later, a classmate of mine from Cork University called Paddy Barry from Fremont in Charleville was working in Pasadena in California, and he was fond of Irish music and listening to an Irish radio station. Next thing he heard the Graiguenamanagh ceili band from their LP, so he phoned them up and got details of it and was able to pick it up in the local record shop and sent it to me, and that's the only copy we ever had of it, and that's it there in front of us now, with the bridge in Graiguenamanagh on the front cover. I heard afterwards that the records were on sale at some shop in Dublin, but nobody ever found them. So I think I've got the only copy in Ireland. It was sold supposedly in the States and in Canada. Dominion Records of Toronto pressed it.
What happened then with the Graiguenamanagh ceili band? So,
well, the following year in August, we had passed auditions successfully for Ceili House, and on August the 6th of 1966. We went out live from the O'Connell Hall with Sean O'Murray as the Faratee, and it was produced by Dermot O'Hara. I think he used to conduct the RTE Light Orchestra at the time. After that, we played a lot for a couple of years around the country. As I say, hard work and very little for it. We were envious of the pop bands making the big money, but for us, we just about covered our expenses. And I have to say, we did it out of dedication for the love of it, because we did love it.
What was the feeling around Graiguenamanagh when you were heading to RTE Radio to do a national broadcast? Was there much about it locally?
There was great excitement. Practically every house in Graig, I think, had the radio on. We're waiting for it to come on at 10:30 on a hot August evening. And the talk of the town afterwards, and on the Kilkenny People, the Carlow Nationalist, and we were heroes altogether, because we, as I say in Graig, we put them on the map.
Great memories?
Excellent memories, yeah. Part of me.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
The Graiguenamanagh ceili band there with the Sliabh-na-Mán hornpipe, followed by the Galway hornpipe, recorded in 1965, and that's from their LP, which they made at that time. There's one copy in the country that we know of. If you've got a copy, why don't you let us know? Ceili at rte.ie, ceili at rte.ie.